Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. My name is Victoria Hendrickson. I'm a partner and vice president on the consulting side here at OrgVitality, and I'm thrilled to be your MC for this webinar. Today, we have Dr. Julian Allen joining us. He's going to be discussing his 360 program over at MiTek. So our title today is Developing a Robust 360, how MiTek developed and created their 360. So our format today is pretty informal. After I introduce Dr. Allen, he'll go through a couple of slides covering some context, and then we'll open it up to some Q&A. So as you're listening today, please feel free to pop any questions into the Q&A or the chat function. We'll monitor those, and then at the end of the slides, we'll go ahead and dive right in. If we run out of time for all of your questions, we will follow up with you via email. So with all of that started, let me just go ahead and dive in and introduce Dr. Allen. We are so excited to have Julian with us today. So in terms of formal introductions, Dr. Julian B. Allen is the Director of Talent Management at MiTek, a Berkshire Hathaway company. In this role, he leads the design and execution of MiTek's core talent processes, including performance management, talent and succession planning, leadership assessment, and surveys. Previously, he was with PepsiCo on the global talent management team, serving in multiple roles across employee listening, leadership assessment, and selection. With a background in survey research and consulting here at OrgVitality, and a PhD in industrial organizational psychology from Pennsylvania State University, Julian has deep experience in talent management and talent analytics. So with all of that, clearly Julian has a breadth of experience from the external side with us, which of course we valued so much, to leading in an organization with a history of robust employee listening programs, to now really building it from scratch. So with that said, I'm going to pass it to him for some brief context on that journey, and then we'll get into some questions. Julian, take it away.
Thanks, Victoria. Thanks for the awesome introduction, and thanks for organizing this as well and inviting me for the fireside chat. Before we jump in, though, I did want to just briefly introduce MiTek as an organization. It's definitely not a household name company, so wanted to just spend a little bit of time with some putting it through some context of what MiTek is, who we are. We were established around the 1950s, and as Victoria mentioned, we are a Berkshire Hathaway Company since 2001. MiTek, as an organization, specializes in offsite construction technology, and our vision is really to transform communities through more efficient and sustainable building methods. What I mean by offsite construction, it's really the planning, design, and manufacturing at a location other than the actual construction site, which can bring multiple financial, project timeline, and sustainability benefits. So MiTek as a whole, we kind of provide the full gamut of software, machinery, and the components needed to make offsite construction a reality. As a company, we're about 6,500 employees globally, operating across a breadth of countries and locations. But with that understanding in mind, though, I did want to just jump right in to the great work that we've been doing here. And wanted to start with kind of some context around our organization. So even though we've been around for an extended period of time, we have a long history of success. For a long period of time, there's been this understanding around talent of, I know what good looks like when I see it, which I'm sure rings true for a lot of the people on this call. And as we know and well understand, is that's not necessarily defensible or a strategic approach to talent. So thankfully, our current CEO, Mark Tom, who started in 2017, and our CHRO, Lisa Tyree, that started in 2020, had the foresight to kind of shift this mentality and lay the foundation for more of an integrated talent strategy. And they took the time to just kind of initiate our talent management team, which is the team that I'm on, in 2021. And as we were coming on board, one of our first key tasks was really to define what the skills and behaviors that drive effective leadership and define potential within the organization truly are, because we wanted to take that foundation of being a skills-based organization into all of our talent processes and really have that as the foundation for any talent management initiatives. So with that in mind, we developed the framework that you see up on the slide here, which is our leadership blueprint, which defines great leadership within the organization. We developed this through a series of interviews with our senior leadership team, focus groups across the organization, and really a deep grounding in the leadership literature of what great leadership does look like. And we derived these 7 key competencies, which are the ones in blue on the screen. And sticking to 7, given that magical number of 7 plus or minus 2 that we can recall, recite, and remember more easily. But each of these areas are intended to reflect key skills and abilities and behaviors that we know results in effective leadership at MiTek specifically. Hence that grounding in what our leaders view as effective leadership, what feedback we received from employees across levels in the organization as well. Along the bottom, what you see here is our guiding principles. These are our values at MiTek, and this visual was very purposeful, where we wanted to highlight the fact that our leadership competencies are grounded in our values as well. So as we know that one of our values is unity, we want to see that reflected in our competencies, and that comes out through our connect competency as an example of building relationships with others and forging connections and partnerships. So I won't go into each of the competencies in detail, but I did want to highlight just in kind of reflecting on developing this framework and taking more of a homegrown approach versus an off-the-shelf approach. I saw a stat recently where the majority of companies tend to take more of an off-the-shelf approach, either kind of leveraging a framework that might have been provided from a consulting company. And I get some of the benefits there where it might be previously established. There's hopefully some validation that's been done on that framework, and there might be some norms or benchmark data available. But personally for me, I think the missing link there is that connection back to the organization strategy and the ability to really ingrain the behaviors into all talent processes, from hiring into training, evaluating, and developing talent. And the other key components missing is more of that brand alignment. So you're using language that's understandable to all employees within the company versus those off-the-shelf solutions might not necessarily meet all the criteria that you might need, or really highlight the behaviors that you know you'd like to develop and grow within your organization. So that with those ideas in mind, that's what really pushed us to create our own framework versus taking more of an off-the-shelf approach. Shifting to the next slide, once we developed the framework, we really took time to ingrain it within the organization in a very particular way. So more specifically, we wanted employees to better understand that leadership can be measured, and more specifically, it's measured and evaluated based on these 7 competencies. So it provides them with a consistent language that they should be using for their personal development, for developing their teams, or even growing the organization as a whole. And with that in mind, we also communicated that it's a framework that's applicable to all employees. I have seen organizations roll out a competency model that's more so for people leaders or even for executives. But in this case, in order to really grow our talent pipeline from the bottom up, we wanted to clearly communicate that all of us can be leaders. We all exhibit leadership characteristics and qualities in our day-to-day life. And with that in mind, the 7 competencies are applicable to all roles, all levels within the company. And from there, what we've also taken great strides since we launched the framework last year is in how we're actually leveraging it. So we've integrated it across our talent lifecycle, into our development programs, into talent planning, succession planning, into various development initiatives as well. So really reinforcing and ingraining that these are the competencies that we want employees thinking about and developing as well. Shifting to the next slide. So touching just briefly on the idea of like how are we actually leveraging the framework internally in the organization. We, in partnership with OrgVitality, we took the time to develop behavioral indicators for each of the 7 competencies. So we operationalized what each of those 7 competencies truly means for employees, and have 5 behavioral indicators for each of the 7. So this provides them with greater understanding of what that means to them. It provides us a form of measurement as well to evaluate our proficiency on the competencies, or for our manager, our peers, or direct reports to provide us feedback on them as well. These behavioral indicators, though, do break down even further. The visual you see on the left-hand side, the pyramid, these are 3 tiers of indicators. So we have the developing, advance, and expand, which is connected to our job architecture. So as you can imagine, the complexity of leadership looks very different at our executive levels versus someone that's at an individual contributor level. So the behavioral indicators reflect that as well. So for the deliver competency as an example, which is around delivering results of high quality and quantity, it might look very different in scope and impact that an individual contributor can drive versus an executive that might be focusing on performance for their entire function or their department. So those behavioral indicators are then reflected within that as well, and we're able to provide more accurate feedback. These indicators then fully transition over to our 360 process. So as I mentioned, we've partnered with OV on administering the 360, and we started piloting it in around end of 2021, the beginning of 2022. And we were at this point, we've now put through around 120 of our leaders through the 360. And we're primarily focusing on leveraging it for development purposes at this point. We wanted to make sure team members across the organization fully understand what the competencies are, how they can leverage them before using any of our data for talent planning or decision-making purposes. So the 360, we have 3 waves throughout the year. We primarily focus on our top talent or high potential employees, and we leverage it in order to help them create an individual development plan that they can take action on by leveraging that feedback on the 7 competencies. And last slide for me, and we can open it up to questions, but I just wanted to highlight kind of our journey from developing the framework in 360 all the way up to enabling it and embedding it within the organization. And just a few kind of stories along the way and lessons learned. When we were first starting these initiatives of developing the competency model, we connected with our senior leadership team and really started asking them, what does great leadership look like to you, and what is required for an individual to be a successful leader within the organization? And kind of boiling down a lot of the responses that we got, it ended up being that they didn't necessarily have the vocabulary to truly describe it to us and provide the information that we needed to take action on it. A lot of the responses that we ended up getting is effective leadership is leadership, and someone needs to have leadership in order to be an effective leader. So we kind of needed to take a step back and think through a lot of kind of the more I'd say advanced leadership behaviors that we know it should be embedded into a competency framework, such as maybe taking strategic risks. We needed to shift those down a level. So meeting the organization where it's at was a huge thing in developing the competency model, where we heard a lot of kind of table stakes behaviors, or at least behaviors that we would say are table stakes, that we needed to signal to the company that we're important, even though even though we think we may be further along than that. As an example, we got feedback around the idea of we need to reinforce the importance of keeping yourself and others accountable on delivering results. Delivering results is something that we think is just at that table stakes level of we need to do that effectively, but really good leadership potential, it looks like a step or two above that. But given where the company was at, we needed to still ensure that was ingrained into the framework. So one of our competencies is that deliver competency and making sure to signal that across the company. On the develop stage, I also wanted to highlight just a story from our 360. And when we started piloting the 360, this was prior to us even launching the competency model internally. We wanted to get some feedback on the process, on the behavioral statements as well. And we decided to pilot with a majority of our vice presidents and above population, which was a very high stakes population to be piloting with, given the visibility and their overall role within the company. But we kind of did this purposefully as well in order to build advocates within the organization as prior to rolling out the actual competency model. The pilot was probably about 2 months or so before we rolled out the competencies. And what this ultimately, in hindsight, helped us do is that we had individuals in the organization that already understood at a deeper level what the competencies provided them for their own personal development. And they already had a little bit of better understanding of the language of how to speak to them, how to leverage them in talent conversations or career conversations with their team members as well. So I'm not fully sold on if I would recommend piloting with your VP population, but in hindsight, I will say it did help us with the overall launch, and they did provide good feedback on the overall process as well. Shifting just briefly into the launch of the actual competency model, we had a lot of fanfare around it. We had videos from our executive team speaking to each of the competencies, a self-assessment, development resources that were mapped to each of the competencies to really bring those all to life for our employees. But I wanted to highlight from a launch standpoint for the 360, one activity that we really took time in doing is upskilling our HR function on the leadership blueprint competencies and the 360 process. Apart from just taking them through what the process is, what a report looks like, and training them on how to interpret it, we actually had them go through a 360 themselves. And I find that HR is frequently kind of put to the bottom of the list for any development programs. But in this case, we wanted to make sure that they felt like strategic partners to their leaders going through the process, and to ensure that they could actually look at someone's report and provide them with feedback on what areas they'd like to take action on, or provide them any development recommendations based on their strengths and opportunities. So as part of that launch process, we really took the time to educate our HR partners on the whole 360. And the last point I'll call out here is in the embedding stage. Frequently I see with competency models and 360 assessments is the desire to rush to leverage that data for decision-making purposes. And I recognize at times that's required and needed, but in our case, we wanted to make sure that everyone had a deeper understanding of what the competencies are before leveraging it for any decision making. So since the pilot and launch of our 360, we've been leveraging exclusively for development purposes, and slowly been opening it up more so as far as access to the feedback reports. So we started with only employees receiving access to the report, Now the participant and the HR partner receives access, and then we could started communicating that next year their immediate manager would receive access as well, and that data would start being leveraged as one of multiple components into talent planning conversations as well. So really kind of taking our time to ingrain the competencies and the value of the 360 process to ensure that people feel comfortable providing feedback, receiving feedback, and acting on that prior to leveraging for any decision making. That I've found has been hugely beneficial for us as we've been rolling that out. I think that's about it for me, and happy to open up to any questions from you, Victoria, or the chat.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Julian. What a great example of a strategically focused, science-backed program where you really took the time to bring folks along, do things the right way, and embed it throughout the organization. We do have a lot of questions coming in. I am getting notes that the chat function may be disabled for some folks. Questions are coming in through the Q&A portion though, so if you do have questions, feel free to pop them into that portion. Let's see, we got some questions about how this is linked to performance management. I think kind of answered along the way during your last slide there, so appreciate that. Okay, we have a question about the pilot. So you mentioned in hindsight that you might not choose the VP level for your pilot if you were to do it again. If you were to do it all again, who would you have piloted with?
It's an excellent question. I think given the fact that our framework is tiered, where we have the individual contributor tier, manager to director, and then executive tier, I think from a data standpoint, I would have preferred to have more of an even distribution of groups or participants across those three groups, so we could get a better representation of what the behaviors look like, how the ratings are working, and the overall process as well. I think a lot of our VP and above population are individuals that have direct reports as well. And since then, we've had multiple individuals participate that don't necessarily have direct reports, which changes the process slightly from a 360 to a 180, where they just get their peer and manager feedback. So I think piloting more with a realistic group that ranges in areas of the organization and level could have provided a better understanding of maybe more so what process changes we would like to make early on. But I still stand by the idea of the pilot with the VPs did help us ingrain the framework though.
Yeah, I'm sure it really got their buy-in, but that more stratified sample would help you pilot the process itself for the whole organization. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, that's really helpful. The next question is about action. So can you tell us a bit more about what happens when participants receive a report? What type of support do they get? What's expected of them? Does HR work with them? Do they get a coach? What's next?
Yeah, absolutely. It's I think this is an ongoing process for us to continue working on and improving. At least when we were initially piloting the 360, and I'd say most of last year with this as well, given just the size of our immediate team and the fact that we were still educating our HR partners on how to interpret and act on results, we took more of a group debrief approach. We essentially didn't have the resources to meet one-on-one with each of the participants to take them through the results. So we had a group session that we outlined more so how to interpret your specific report. And then we provided a lot of resources as far as content mapped to each, learning content mapped to each of the competencies so they could take action through that learning content on our LMX. And then we also provide them with an individual development plan that they can fill out and complete based on the results as well. And we invite them to reach out if they have any questions, but primarily we were also pushing on the idea of meet with your manager, meet with your feedback providers to discuss what you believe you need to take action on, and ensuring that they agree with that based on the feedback that was provided. Now, where we're moving towards is the idea of HR business partners being more involved in the process. We're still holding that group debrief session just as a more so, how do you actually interpret your report? But we're having HR partners meet one-on-one with each of the participants to not just debrief them on the results, but focus more on the what's next process. So they'll meet with each of the participants, they'll have access to the participant's report, and the idea is that the participant will come prepared with what they think they should take action on, and that HR partner can serve as that coach to take them through that, provide any recommendations, ensure that they're sharing any feedback with their manager as well. But slowly getting to the idea of one-on-one debriefs. We tend to prioritize those, I'd say, more so for our executive levels to start, and eventually, given appropriate resources, that would be the kind of goal for all individuals going through a 360.
That's great. Lots of support, and with that HR support model, I'm sure it really helps that they've gone through the process. So they've got some of that context. So y'all were planning well. Let's see, a kind of broader philosophical question. So we talked a little bit about how you use this data. So the question is, how do you determine when data should be used for staffing versus only for development?
It's a good question. I think in our case, we wanted to ensure, as I mentioned, a deeper understanding of the competencies, and before expecting anyone to be an expert on them or be evaluated against them. So with in our case too, we wanted to have a internal benchmark of where results were landing. So as given that we created our own competency model on 360, we don't necessarily have benchmark data externally. So we want to have at least a robust sample of participants that have gone through already before leveraging that for any benchmarking or decision-making purposes. So next year we should have a decent sample size to be able to start leveraging it for decision-making just from a sample standpoint. But primarily we want to ensure that participants just fully understand what the framework is for, how to leverage it before using it for any decision making.
Yeah, I know leaders can be eager to use it for decision making right away, but really taking that time can pay dividends in the confidence in the model and the use of your feedback and all of your listening programs, and kind of the trust in that. Speaking of trust in data, the next question relates to the feedback provided. So is the feedback anonymous? So just across your different rater types, what that looks like.
Yeah, of course. So in our case, and I believe this is pretty standard now for most 360s as well, we only report results for each data group if 3 or more participants respond. So if less than if that rater group drops to less than 3, it says insufficient data, it's not included in that overall average for the item or the overall competency. And apart from that, we also do not report who did or did not respond. We do report the overall rater list that the participant selected. So we might we'll share like 60% of your raters responded, but we won't necessarily highlight who of the raters actually responded. And that's more so for the quantitative ratings. For qualitative comments, we have two questions in the survey around what are someone's strengths, what should they continue doing, what's some areas that they should be working on. And in that case, just given the fact that we report comments verbatim, where we don't necessarily modify any of the responses that are provided, we group together the peers, direct reports, and any other raters that provided the comments together, just so there's not a deeper understanding of, well, like this person tends to write like this, and that's who I think they are. The only exception to all of this is the manager. Given the manager sample of one, they do know what their manager rated them as and what comments were provided by the manager as well.
Perfect. We are just about at time. So Julian, I just want to give you one more, kind of opportunity, just if there are any main learnings or pieces of advice you'd like to leave our audience with.
Yeah, for sure. So I'd say start small, and keep in mind that it doesn't have to be perfect right from launch. We've iterated on the framework for an extended period of time. We've made tweaks to the 360 process along the way as well. But just getting your foot in the door to define what the key skills and abilities and behaviors are that you want employees thinking about and developing against is the starting point, and you can modify that along the way to make improvements. Yeah, I'd say that's kind of the main advice I'd say for now.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. This has been really valuable, and I appreciate you taking the time to answer all the questions that came in. For everyone on the phone, we will be providing a link to the recording as well as the slides. So all of this will be available for your reference moving forward. Thanks for joining, and thanks again, Julian. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, Victoria.